beginning of the animated series Batman Beyond, we see an aging Bruce Wayne fighting crime as Batman and lagging behind the villains in his old age. Batman is close to losing the fight, even with his newer and upgraded suit, and in a defensive moment grabs a fallen firearm and points it at a criminal. He doesn't shoot, and it's enough to frighten the crook, but Batman clearly feels something between disappointed and disgusted, and decides that night to hang up his cowl. We skip forward in time to see a futuristic Gotham City, now with no Batman to watch over it. The show begins to follow a young man named Terry McGinnis along with his friends, mother, and brother. There's a lot about Terry that I love, but for our purpose here, we're going to focus on one element of his characterization in particular. This is a show that I go back to watch all the time. It actually reminds me of one of my favorite poets, who we'll return to momentarily, but the point is that I think there's some real emotional content to Terry's story. Some quick highlights from this show that I think are totally fantastic are the Joker special, where there's this idea that the Joker might have returned or that he might be an impersonator, and the backstory is that it's a kind of brainwashing that happened to Robin when he was abducted by the Joker, and ended up killing the Joker after being turned into his little mini-me junior Joker. It's just so tragic and rich with characterization for a lot of the legacy Batman characters, but my favorite elements are the dynamics between Bruce and Terry and the Joker. The fake Joker still broadly has the personality of the original Joker, so he's tormented by the idea of not being validated by Batman, and because Terry is the new Batman being trained up by Bruce, he has a different code and a different way of doing things, including being more willing to taunt the Joker or fight dirty, which is just such a great twist for a kind of Joker-Batman reunion in this type of show. Another great villain reference is when Terry gets to meet Bane, and it's a red herring where he thinks Bane is going to be behind the Venom supply, but actually it's the opposite. Bane is totally frail due to using Venom for so many years. There's a bunch of little moments like that in the show, but there are also successors to the original villains. There's a gang of Jokers now who are really more aesthetic imitators who aren't quite as serious and sociopathic as the original Joker. There's a Royal Flush gang that includes a kind of star-crossed love interest for Terry, if only for a very brief duration. But it's a neat concept that gives Terry his own kind of Catwoman moment, or at least what some female villains occasionally were for Batman in his day. There's also an indication that two of the Jokers are twin granddaughters of Harley Quinn, Barbara Gordon is the new commissioner, and in addition to direct nods to previous elements of Batman, there are a lot of successor elements to the original. I've noticed an ambient nostalgia for this show that kind of reflects the nostalgia that the show itself seemed to have displayed, for when a lot of the ideas in Batman felt a lot more fresh, new, and exciting. In a way, it's kind of come full circle. I'd love to get more Batman Beyond in some other form of adaptation. A couple ideas off the top of my head are something like an animated film with an engaging style a la Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, maybe called something like Batman Into the Beyond as a kind of DC equivalent. The idea would be to develop the concept in the direction of having Terry interact with other versions of Batman, and have him kind of be informed as Bruce's successor by virtue of interacting with him at multiple levels. Another adaptation idea that I saw someone else share online recently was the concept of a Batman Arkham game, maybe called something like Batman Beyond Arkham, which in principle could pick up where the other Arkham games leave off, but return to a cyberpunk Gotham farther into the future, and navigate what it means to be Batman in that context. All this and more could, if well executed, be a great opportunity for creators who love Batman, and also just for studios who are willing to pick up the projects. That's my elevator pitch for a Batman Beyond animated film and video game tie-in, so there you go. I do want to address the window dressing of the series, which I think is crucial. I don't know if I'd call it cyberpunk exactly, but it does have a kind of techno-futuristic setting that engages with a lot of similar concepts. From a sound design perspective, I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention the other elements that I love, like the soaring electric guitar that surges in so many key moments in the soundtrack. I think the show was trying to go for a combination of grungy rock with futuristic techno sounds, at least for certain key moments. You get a lot of that from the opening theme, for example. In terms of character elements, some of the larger villains, or more emotionally moving elements in the series are connected, for example, to the idea of corporate interests poisoning the environment and destroying human lives for profit, which is connected back to the idea that the world has left Batman behind, and that it will take a new Batman to fill his shoes, or cowl, or robo-suit. Either way, there's a deep connection between the setting and the relationship between Terry and Bruce. Terry's father, at least in this series in the sense of the man he grew up with, was a victim of that corporate corruption, and so Terry has lost a father figure that he then finds in Bruce Wayne when he finds himself taking refuge on the grounds at Wayne Manor and wandering into the Batcave. Bruce saves Terry, or rather, they team up against the Jokers, and then Bruce actually asks Terry to go get him his medicine, since the fight seems to have exacerbated his condition. There's something neat about this situation that I think comes from the fact that Bruce emerges as Terry's savior, and then Terry gets to help save Bruce in return. There's a little give and take, with the older man and younger man each using what they can bring to the situation in terms of experience and fitness. Bruce uses his cane in the fight, and Terry gets to be more kinetic and jump around and kick things. Terry ends up wandering into the Batcave because he's trying to save the bat that he sees trapped in the secret entrance behind the grandfather clock, a metaphor for how he's trying to help Bruce, who has been cooped up in here, which is such a great little bit of characterization given that Batman originally chose his aesthetic as a way to take ownership of that childhood fear and use it in his favor, as his strength. Terry approaches the bat with compassion, which in turn means that, like Bruce, his relationship to that bat as an animal prefigures his relationship to the role of Batman. Terry is more carefree and openly compassionate, whereas Bruce's compassion was always an understated beauty of his character in, for example, the Justice League Unlimited anime series that was loosely contemporary to the era of this show, which shows in the similarity in style in the famous crossover episode. Terry helps Bruce, but offends him by finding the Batcave and finds out in short order that his father has been murdered, which parallels the catalyst for Bruce becoming Batman as well. The similarities in their origin also calls attention to the differences. What does it mean for a young man to respond to his surrogate father figure by taking a fear made into strength and further transforming that into compassion? Terry is a strong character, to be sure, but he's also tricky and funny and kind in a very direct way. He's not the perfect character, and he definitely has a certain angst that probably would have felt kind of textbook and tropey at the time, but which now feels somber and understated. Something I noticed a lot rewatching this series as an adult is that Terry is very focused on acting in the right way, not because he has a strict code, but more specifically because he's a deeply compassionate person, an elevation of what was previously a very understated element of the original Batman in many incarnations, but which mirrors his nature. Where newer superhero series might choose to elevate other elements of on-screen comic book characters in their stories, pushing their moral dilemmas to their limits or testing their powers to their absolute greatest extent, or expanding the world of the comic book superhero to a global, solar, galactic, or multiversal degree, I think the reason why Terry McGinnis is my favorite Batman arises from how this series is a little different. It's not just that the scale is a little smaller and more intimate than some of its contemporaries, it's also that the core of the story and its themes and characters are centered more intimately on Terry's relationships, especially his family relationships and especially his relationship to Bruce as his surrogate father figure. Batman Beyond is therefore, like so much Batman material before it, a discourse in fatherhood and family generally. And what it does with that idea is ask a specific question, which is, what if instead of Batman as an equal parts father and partner, we had Batman as a retired father figure outside most of the action, operating in more of an oracle kind of role, so that his surrogate son character can succeed him in the role of Batman itself. I like that, and I love the choice of setting and specific character of Terry. I love how different his personal challenges are, and what a great series of points of contrast his navigation of his responsibilities as Batman almost immediately draws with what we already know about Bruce, and the fact that we already know Bruce makes this another great adaptation of the concept of Batman, because frequently adaptations are judged based on how they reproduce originals with fidelity, and this allows us to take a character we love and see him in a new role, already understanding effectively everything about him that we need to understand, so there's no need for pointless retreads. This is a Batman origin story, but it's the origin of a new Batman. I've heard that Batman as a series is great to a lot of people largely because of its villains, and I think that makes sense if it's intended as a statement on Batman's relationships with his villains. I've also heard that some people's favorite Batman-villain confrontation is with Joe Chill, who in many continuities, most as far as I'm aware, is the gunman who killed Bruce's parents. This kind of confrontation is fun to write because it brings Batman, his self-concept, and his principles full circle. We get to potentially see Batman tested to the greatest extent he can be. In Batman Beyond, there are a few villains who have a role in Terry's father's death, but the highest and most prominent villain at the top of it all is Derek Powers, who eventually becomes the supervillain, Blight. Blight represents the toxicity and poison that corporations bring to the environment, but also the influence of that business power more broadly on society and human beings. And so his powers are, for Terry, what the gun is for Batman on a certain level. So there's an explicit environmentalist message in the show. It's the kind of unsubtle comic book politics that I remember so strongly from my youth. You may have seen this meme featuring Blight where he says, "Do you have the slightest idea how little that narrows it down?" This is his response to learning that he's responsible for Terry's father's death, when he finally gets curious about who this new Batman is and why they've come into conflict. Of course, these two characters are unified on multiple levels. Blight represents for Neo Gotham's Batman what Powers is to Terry directly. Powers is also taking control of Bruce's company. So there's another level to the conflict where he isn't just interpersonally and symbolically a foe to Terry, he's also a threat to Terry's inheritance of the role of Batman and his relationship with Bruce Wayne's legacy. I like this meme because it's funny, but it also represents the character super well, really showcasing with sometimes even just a single line how evil and perverse Blight is, and how destructive to human life Powers always was. Terry, in the spirit of Batman, often tries to save his villains, even when they've done him and the city wrong. Blight is generally understood to be dead or indefinitely retired after his battle with Batman ends with him sinking his own submarine to the bottom of the ocean. I think dialing up Blight and Terry's relationship to the point that Powers is undone in his competition with a more emotionally forward Batman, by virtue of the instability created by his own power, draws a distinction between the moral cores of those two characters, and shows how Batman as an idea develops and changes from Bruce to Terry. Blight is a disease manifest in a person, a human being bound to destroy himself and those around him, if not the world. And Terry is just one person affected by that malignancy, who allows his compassion and his surrogate father figure to direct him to respond in a healthy and helpful way. Similarly, Bruce is the Batman who was and is no longer, who created the idea of a Batman as a symbol of fear turned inward on itself, so that only those who do wrong should fear the night. Because Terry iterates on this like a son to a father, Batman Beyond therefore becomes a discourse in masculinity and fatherhood, a story about the idea of a person who helps other people being passed down between generations and evolving to deal with not just a changing world, but also the changing natures of those people. I mentioned earlier that this show reminded me of one of my favorite poets, of whom you've probably heard, and I imagine you've even heard of the poem in question. It's called Harlem by Langston Hughes, and as far as I'm aware, its first known publication was in the early 1950s. It goes like this. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore, and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Or crust and sugar over, like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? This was one of those poems we had to read when I was in school that I connected with a lot, because later in life I really felt like it represented something I had lost, some chance or opportunity or sense of myself, my own dream deferred. And I remembered something my own father had said to me about how his dreams changed when he had children, and about how having a family as soon as he had the opportunity became the most important thing to him. I think the 20th century, and this is probably the world's coldest Harlem take of all time, similarly recontextualized Langston Hughes's words, especially the first and last lines, with discourses during and after what we now call the Civil Rights era. Martin Luther King Jr. is frequently quoted in the terms of his I Have a Dream speech, saying, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin but by the content of their character. Another thing I learned in school," but less so for his sentiment in his book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, where he affirmed the sentiment that, quote, "A society that has done something special against the Negro for hundreds of years must now do something special for the Negro," end quote. I do apologize for the dated language, as much as these are famous statements, but I felt it was necessary to make the quote in Dr. King's terms in this particular case. The version of MLK that many Americans find so palatable is the one that wishes for a far-off justice like Judgment Day, one that rests in the hearts and minds of the American people. The version of MLK that seems to have really lived and spoken in his own words seems to be a little different, speaking often to a need for action in our very lifetimes. In the United States of America, if the nation that had done something special against black people in America for so long does indeed not do something special for them, that is, if medicine is not applied discriminatingly to the injured and the injury, then it seems Dr. King's dream, like so many, continues to be deferred, and a city, a nation, a culture can, I must imagine, only so long abide such injury without healing and injustice without justice before it explodes. Much of white America rejected Dr. King's message and continues that tradition, which is also the tradition that created him and his politics to this day. He was not merely a good man who lived admirably, but a real thinker with ideas responding to his historical circumstances. Another part of that ideology was a profound rejection of not just racism and poverty, but also militarism. These, of course, with our point of reference being three of the great wars waged on fronts social to practical by a white racial order against black Americans. Why say all of this here and now? Well, I think I see something of Dr. King's denunciation of militarism in Batman, not entirely or perfectly, but in a small measure, and not merely in the character of Batman, but also in the themes and situations of his story in Batman Beyond. I also think I see Langston Hughes' Harlem in Neo Gotham, and in the relationship Bruce has to Terry. Where once Bruce's dream was deferred, sagging like a heavy load he could no longer bear, now it is no longer. Much has been made of the ill-defined notion of a positive masculinity, and how difficult that discourse is to engage with, when so much of masculinity, toxic or otherwise, returns to ideas about strength. Batman needs strength, certainly, but in the same way that Batman Beyond is about a surrogate son and surrogate father passing down a legacy, it may also posit an alternative notion of strength altogether, or begin to. How many times does that mantle of Batman pass into the future before the slow change of generations see Batman's strength not in his martial arts and ability to master fear psychologically, but in his compassion? It's often said that Batman doesn't have any powers, but I don't think that's true. I think he has a truly great power. He turns fear into hope, and hatred into compassion. Maybe today that doesn't quite make justice. Maybe our society needs more time and more action to heal. But a dream of a strength that means conviction, and a strength that means compassion, of a justice that means healing and a justice that means peace, that dream remains alive, passed down, if we are wise, from fathers to sons, from parents to children, from family to friends, from Batman to Batman Beyond.